On February 5, 2026, Cuba's national electrical grid experienced a catastrophic failure that left Santiago de Cuba, the island's second largest city with over 400,000 residents, without power for 26 consecutive hours. During peak demand hours, 64% of the entire island lost electricity simultaneously. The Antonio Guterres power plant, one of Cuba's largest generators, went offline, eliminating 200 megawatts of capacity. Energy analysts at KPLA, which tracks global petroleum flows via satellite, stated in late January that Cuba can function for 15 to 20 days at then current consumption levels with remaining reserves. That timeline has now expired. Without new shipments, Cuba isn't facing rolling blackouts. It's facing total grid collapse. No electricity means no water pumping, no refrigeration, no hospital equipment, no public transportation, no fuel distribution systems. The Cuban government has implemented a 4-day workweek for state employees, reduced school sessions to half-time, restricted interprovincial transportation, and closed non-essential public services. These measures aim to preserve fuel for critical infrastructure, hospitals, food production, water treatment. But they also represent acknowledgement that Cuba cannot maintain normal operations at current oil availability levels. Cuba's water supply systems depend on electrical power for pumping and purification. When the grid fails, water stops flowing. Artemisa province reported an 83% reduction in water availability. Havana experienced an 80% reduction. Millions of Cubans now face simultaneous fuel and water shortages, unable to cook, clean, or maintain basic sanitation. Cuba's Minister of Public Health, José Ángel Portal Miranda, announced in early February that hospitals would substantially decrease surgical activity. The reason? Surgical procedures require significant electricity consumption and minimum safety conditions that the collapsing grid cannot guarantee. Elective surgeries are cancelled, emergency procedures are delayed. Patients are sent home to rest without treatment because facilities lack the power to operate safely. Provincial hospitals report shortages of critical medications including painkillers, antibiotics, and gauze. Some facilities lack electricity to refrigerate essential medicines, rendering temperature-sensitive drugs unusable. Cuba is experiencing a triple epidemic: dengue, Oropouche virus, 626 confirmed cases, 76 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome, 25 encephalitis cases, and chikungunya with 38,938 cases. In 1 week in early February, 33 people died from these diseases, including 21 minors. Hospitals lack diagnostic reagents, treatment capacity, and the electricity necessary to maintain equipment. The state-owned company Medlip is expanding production of plant-based syrups, oregano, eucalyptus, aloe vera, marketed as treatments. The regime frames this as innovation. The reality? There's nothing else. Modern pharmaceuticals require imports that demand foreign currency Cuba doesn't have, or domestic production requiring electricity Cuba can't generate. When hospitals offer herbal syrups instead of antibiotics, it's not a choice, it's the only option remaining. In early February 2026, food prices in Havana reflected total disconnection from official wages. Potatoes 450 pesos per pound, onions 380, beans 500, meat 1,000. A single modest grocery purchase for basic staples, 10,300 pesos. Meanwhile, average state workers earn 6,130 pesos monthly, teachers earn 5,495 pesos, healthcare workers earn 6,562 pesos. A doctor earning 4,500 pesos, approximately $16 at informal exchange rates, cannot afford rice, chicken, or toothpaste in a month's salary. This is what maximum pressure produces in practice. Hospitals without power, people without water, wages that can't buy food, and a population that's lost 1 million people to emigration since 2021. 18% of the total population fleeing in 5 years. The humanitarian catastrophe is documented. Now the strategic question: can the regime survive what's coming? And if it can't, what happens next? On February 5th, President Miguel Díaz-Canel stated that Cuba is willing to engage in dialogue with the United States, a dialogue on any topic, but without pressure or preconditions, and emphasized that any talks must occur from a position of equals, with respect for our sovereignty, our independence and our self-determination, and without interference in our internal affairs. This frames Cuba as open to negotiation whilst drawing a red line. The political system, constitution and sovereignty are not negotiable regardless of pressure. Diaz-Canel invoked the revolutionary slogan, "Homeland or death, we will never surrender," positioning the crisis as a test of revolutionary commitment against imperialism. He referenced the 32 Cubans killed fighting US forces during the Venezuela raid on January 3rd, framing American actions as military aggression that Cuba must resist at all costs. President Trump stated in early February, "I think we're going to make a deal with Cuba," asserting that the United States is talking to the people from Cuba, the highest people in Cuba, to see what happens. The White House messaging suggests imminent substantive negotiations, but multiple reports contradict this narrative. According to reporting based on accounts from 5 Cuban and American officials requesting anonymity, the deal Trump claims is near completion is not being pursued in any official high-level diplomatic discussions. The only confirmed substantive contacts between Cuban and American officials involve purely technical matters. The United States informs Cuba when flights with deported migrants will arrive. Cuban officials acknowledge receipt. That's it. No negotiations on sanctions relief, political reforms, or crisis resolution. A senior White House official told Dropsite News that Trump's claims about discussions with the highest people in Cuba originate from Secretary of State Marco Rubio's misrepresentation of bilateral relations. The suggestion, Rubio, who has pursued Cuban regime change as a personal political objective for decades, may be deliberately preventing genuine negotiations to ensure diplomatic failure, making regime change the only path forward for an administration that might otherwise prefer a face-saving deal. The regime says it won't negotiate under pressure. Washington sends contradictory signals about whether it wants collapse or a deal. Russia and China pledge support but limit actual deliveries. The oil countdown continues. None of these positions tell you what actually happens when reserves hit zero. Let's map the possible pathways, because the next 30 days will determine which future Cuba enters. The oil countdown creates urgency, but it doesn't determine outcomes. What happens next depends on decisions made in Washington, Havana, Moscow, Beijing, and Mexico City, and on variables including regime cohesion, public tolerance for suffering, and international willingness to either rescue Cuba or watch it collapse. Here are 5 scenarios, each grounded in current evidence, none guaranteed. Scenario 1. Negotiated partial opening. Russia, China, and Mexico stabilize minimal oil supply. 30,000 to 40,000 barrels per day combined, just enough to prevent total grid collapse, but not enough to restore normal function. This buys time for negotiations. Facing unsustainable humanitarian catastrophe, Cuba accepts partial reforms, economic liberalization, political prisoner releases, foreign policy distancing from Russia. In exchange, Trump administration suspends tariffs and allows limited sanctions relief, enough to import petroleum and essential goods. Trump wants wins he can claim as negotiated victories. A deal where Cuba makes symbolic concessions and Trump declares success allows both sides to avoid total war. The regime survives. Trump claims regime change without invasion. Humanitarian crisis stabilizes. But hardliners within Cuba view any concession as existential threat to the revolutionary system. Geisha military elites may refuse reforms that undermine their economic control, and on the US side, Rubio and congressional Republicans may demand regime change, not reform, making partial opening insufficient to lift pressure. Scenario 2. Permanent crisis state. International support provides just enough to prevent total failure, but not enough to restore normal function. Russia sends sporadic shipments, 20-day supplies every few months. China continues symbolic aid. Mexico provides humanitarian goods but no petroleum. Cuba survives at subsistence level indefinitely. Crisis becomes permanent condition. 12-hour blackouts continue. Severe scarcity becomes normalized. Healthcare deteriorates further, but the security apparatus maintains control because the population lacks organization, resources, or capacity for sustained uprising. Cuba survived the 1990s special period after Soviet collapse. GDP contracted 35%, food rationing intensified, blackouts became routine. The regime endured through repression, emigration, which drained dissidents, and eventual partial recovery when Venezuela's Chavez offered oil. This could be Special Period 2.0, with indefinite duration because no equivalent rescuer exists. However, the current crisis differs from the 1990s in comprehensiveness. Cuba faces simultaneous energy collapse, tourism paralysis, demographic exodus, 1 million fled since 2021, and no plausible rescuer. Scenario 3. Regime fracture and transition. Oil runs out completely. Grid collapses entirely for days or weeks. Services fail comprehensively. Regime cannot provision even its core supporters, Giza military elites, security apparatus, party loyalists. When the regime can't feed, pay, or supply its own enforcers, unity breaks. Factions emerge, one arguing that negotiations with the United States represent survival, the other insisting on defiant resistance regardless of cost. A military coup becomes possible if senior officers conclude that Diaz-Canel's approach has failed and a transition government could secure international support. Military-led transition government negotiates with Washington, prisoner releases, constitutional reforms, elections within defined time frame in exchange for immediate sanctions, relief and humanitarian aid. Or reformist faction within the Communist Party initiates gradual opening similar to Vietnam or China, market reforms whilst maintaining party control. If total grid collapse triggers popular uprisings larger than July 2021, regime response determines trajectory. Violent repression could accelerate elite fracture if military commanders refuse orders to fire on massive crowds. Scenario 4. US military intervention. If Supreme Court ruling jeopardizes EPA authority for tariffs, administration escalates to full naval blockade. US Navy prevents all oil imports, even from Russia or China, through force. Or humanitarian catastrophe creates political pressure within the United States for rescue operation, protect civilians, deliver aid, secure order. Do Moscow and Beijing run the blockade, deploying naval escorts for tankers to Cuba? Do they accept American hemispheric dominance and limit responses to diplomatic condemnation? These questions are unknowable until tested. This would represent the most significant US military action in the Western Hemisphere since Panama in 1989, and the first direct confrontation with a state hosting Russian military infrastructure since the Cold War. Lord's facility with 1,000 to 500 Russian personnel creates tripwire risk. Scenario 5. Great power intervention or face-saving deal. Moscow and Beijing decide to make Cuba a multipolarity demonstration, directly challenge US hemispheric control by deploying tanker fleets and military escorts, delivering sufficient oil to stabilize Cuba regardless of American threats. Costly, risky, but possible as great power signaling. Or Trump accepts face-saving deal. Cuba makes symbolic concessions. Trump claims these as major victories, suspends tariffs, declares success. Both sides avoid catastrophic outcomes whilst preserving core interests. Requires all major actors to shift positions simultaneously. Alignment seems improbable, but not impossible. 5 scenarios. The oil countdown continues regardless of which pathway opens. What we know, Cuba cannot sustain current operations without new petroleum supplies. What we don't know, whether the regime negotiates, fractures, endures, or gets toppled by external force. Cuba's crisis validates what Venezuela's collapse already demonstrated. Economic models built on external subsidies collapse when the patron disappears. Whether that patron is global oil prices, Soviet subsidies, or another country's petroleum shipments doesn't fundamentally matter. Dependency creates fatal vulnerability that no amount of ideological commitment can overcome. Venezuela had domestic oil infrastructure it could theoretically reactivate post-Maduro. Production collapsed due to corruption, sanctions and mismanagement, but the resource exists underground. Cuba has no equivalent. It doesn't produce oil. It doesn't have natural gas reserves. It doesn't have diversified exports that generate foreign currency. Cuba's only option was importing petroleum, and when superpowers decide to cut the supply, there's no fallback. For 25 years, Venezuela's subsidized oil masked the urgency of structural reform. Why develop solar infrastructure when petroleum arrives for free? Why restructure state enterprises when losses get covered by resold oil revenue? Why address agricultural collapse when you can import food with foreign currency? The dependency was comfortable until January 3, 2026. Then it became lethal. The lesson: subsidies that prevent pain also prevent adaptation. When they stop, the patient discovers the disease was terminal all along. Russia and China both condemned the blockade as illegal under the UN Charter. Both pledged solidarity and support. Both framed American pressure as unilateral overreach. And both provided token assistance insufficient to prevent Cuba's collapse. Russia sent 100,000 tons of oil in January, 20 days of consumption. China sent $80 million and 60,000 tons of rice. These aren't trivial, but they're not decisive. Russia is constrained by the Ukraine war. China is unwilling to challenge US dominance in the Western Hemisphere when it risks broader economic retaliation. Both value Cuba as a geopolitical signal, Russia's Lord's facility, China's infrastructure projects, but neither values it enough to deploy tanker fleets through American naval interdiction. Whilst analysts map scenarios and diplomats issue statements, 11 million Cubans face the cascade: 26-hour blackouts, hospital surgery cancellations, water supply failures, food prices exceeding monthly wages, diseases spreading without treatment capacity, and mass emigration that's already removed 18% of the population since 2021. Great powers pursue competing interests. The Trump administration tests whether economic siege can force regime change without invasion. Russia and China signal hemispheric presence whilst avoiding confrontation. Mexico navigates impossible choices between solidarity and economic survival. The Cuban regime frames resistance as revolutionary duty, and ordinary Cubans, who didn't choose dependency on Venezuela, didn't design the economic model, didn't decide geopolitical alignments, endure the consequences of decisions made by elites in Havana, Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. We don't know if the regime can negotiate. Diaz-Canel says dialogue is possible without preconditions. Trump claims a deal is imminent. Dropsite news sources say substantive talks haven't begun. Rubio may be blocking negotiations. The gap between public messaging and actual diplomatic contact remains opaque, and that gap determines whether there's an off-ramp from this crisis, or whether it accelerates toward collapse or confrontation. Elite cohesion under total system failure is untested. Cuba's military endured the special period, but this crisis is more comprehensive. If the regime can't provision its enforcers, does unity fracture? Do competing factions emerge? The answer determines whether Cuba faces managed transition, military coup, chaotic fragmentation, or continued authoritarian control despite humanitarian catastrophe. Is this regime change through sustained pressure, or leverage for a negotiated deal? Does the administration want Cuba to collapse, or does it want concessions it can declare as victory? The Supreme Court ruling on IEEPA authority could force escalation to military blockade. Trump's own statements contradict each other. The uncertainty creates strategic ambiguity, but it also means no one, including the actors involved, knows where the red lines actually are. By March, we'll have answers. Cuba either finds a lifeline, negotiates an exit, collapses internally, faces external intervention, or something none of the scenario planners predicted. The unknowns resolve through events, not analysis. It's mid-February 2026. Cuba's oil reserves have likely reached critical levels, possibly days, possibly exhausted, depending on undisclosed rationing measures and unreported shipments. The grid operates sporadically, the humanitarian cascade continues, the geopolitical chess match proceeds, and the question remains unanswered: can 11 million people survive whilst great powers decide what happens to their island? The verdict isn't in yet. The oil countdown continues, the scenarios remain open, the evidence documents the crisis, it doesn't predict the resolution. What we know is this: Cuba entered February 2026 with 15 to 20 days of reserves. We're now past that timeline. What happens when the countdown hits zero? We're about to find out. If you made it this far, through the dependency autopsy, the geopolitical actor analysis, the humanitarian cascade documentation, and the scenario matrix, you've invested serious time in understanding a crisis that most coverage reduces to headlines. This is the story YouTube's algorithm doesn't naturally promote. Too long, too complex, too much context required. No viral hook that fits a 60-second clip. If this analysis was worth your time, hit like to signal that to the algorithm. It genuinely matters for whether this kind of coverage survives on the platform. Subscribe for the next chapter, because this crisis isn't over. By March, we'll know whether Cuba found a lifeline, negotiated an exit, collapsed internally, faced external intervention, or something none of us predicted. The oil countdown that opened this video has likely expired. What happens when reserves hit zero? I'll be documenting whatever unfolds, with the same forensic approach, multiple perspectives, transparent sourcing, evidence layered with context. The verdict on Cuba's crisis isn't in yet, but the evidence keeps accumulating, and I'll keep analysing it. Your engagement makes that possible. Thanks for watching. The story continues.